Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in early in China and in the evening in the United States. This is our birthday party. The European Chamber just about turns 20. And for the month of July, we decided to celebrate with books. This is vacation time, at least for some of you. And that we have now the time to look into books, and plenty of books on China have hit shelves. And I'm very happy that we have a Superpower Showdown today. And as you can imagine from the title, this is not US Europe, this is US China. I'm very happy to have the authors with us today. It's Wei-Ling Ling and Bob Davis, both with the Wall Street Journal, both now based in the United States. And then, of course, Madame WTO, Charlene Barshevsky, who has been helping China to get into WTO 19 years ago. And she was dealing in an environment where the world was not just a zero-sum game, as it appears to be now. I leave it now up to Charlene in order to provoke our authors. And we have our New Jersey, it's Rachel, and she will monitor the questions coming in. And if you have reasonably good questions, she will interrupt and actually post them. So Charlene, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Jörg. It's really a pleasure to be doing this. And let me say, and happy birthday to the Chamber. And say, with respect to Superpower Showdown, which I have here, this is a fabulous book written by two people who really are at the top of their game as journalists and as analysts of China. Bob Davis and Wei-Ling Ling are really first rate, and this book shows it. It's a very clear-eyed view of the nature of relations, really since Deng Xiaoping, with a lot of focus as well on the current situation that the US and China are in. So I thought I would kick this off by asking a question that really, I think is woven in the nature of the narrative about Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. And the question is this, and it's to both Bob and to Wei-Ling Ling, and that is Xi Jinping good for China? So why don't we start, Bob?
Well, I mean, I'll give you the American perspective, right? I mean, the perspective from the U.S. is no, that he's not. You know, that he is moving China in the wrong way economically, and also is, you know, taking China in a kind of an adventurous military fashion that you know, risks upsetting the apple cart even more than it is now. But that's from the U.S. perspective. It's pretty hard to find an American leader that would say anything nice about kind of anybody other than maybe Deng Xiaoping. But I think it'd be more interesting from Ling Ling's perspective, from the Chinese side.
Sure, Charlene. First of all, happy birthday to the Chamber too. And thank you so very much, Jörg and Charlene, for this great opportunity to talk about this book by Bob and me. Really honored. That's a great question, and also one that I don't think there were really very simple answers to, at least from the Chinese perspective. So Xi Jinping's rule so far has been marked by an unprecedented consolidation of power, making himself chairman of everything, and by a very much greater emphasis on ideological purity and party control. So in some ways, he has shattered the existing Chinese system the same way President Trump has done to the existing American establishment. But is it good for China or bad for China? I guess, you know, that's a question, you know, depending on who you ask. People may give you a different answer. from the party's perspective, is definitely good for the party, because we know that in late 2012, when Xi Jinping rose to power, the Communist Party was in crisis, and now the party has come back to the center of Chinese people's life, be it economic activity, socially, politically. Every part of Chinese life now features a very strong hand of the party. Many in the West, as Bob just laid out, definitely the concern and the thinking is China is moving in a wrong direction, further away from political liberalization and market economic liberalization. But at the same time, he also really is enjoying genuine sense of support from the Chinese public. If you do a poll in China today, they probably would give you very high marks for President Xi Jinping's performance. They have, the support has come from his anti-corruption campaign, where York hinted at before the talk started. Obviously, there's a political motivation behind that campaign, sidelining rivals and all that. But by taking down tigers and flies alike, it did help the public think, you know what? He's tackling things previous administration had never done before. Part of also that support also came from his populist programs like poverty reduction, the fight against environmental pollution. I remember just before I came back to New York, sometime in May, I took a trip to my grandfather's hometown, which was a very poor part of the country. Many years ago, the farmers there, they still very much living in poverty. Many years ago, many farmers would hang the portraits of Mao Zedong in their living rooms. And now they replaced Mao Zedong's portraits with Xi Jinping's portraits. I seriously do not think that was forced by the party. It was really genuine feeling from at least some of those people at the bottom level of the social ladder. They felt like, in the past, it was very naked capitalism, under Deng Xiaoping, be you white cat, black cat, as long as you can catch cat, get rich, you're a good cat. So the social inequality has been widening ever since China's economic growth, actually. So a lot of people definitely did feel left out. Similar dynamic in America, right? I mean, many people who supported Trump also felt the same way. They got left out. Same in China. So you do have that those groups of people who are generally feeling like, what, Xi's policy is good for us. And look at the past 2 years, China has survived the trade war, by and large, and survived the pandemic. Looks actually surprisingly good in comparison to the United States and other countries, Western countries like those in Europe. So, and also, even the latest move aimed at Hong Kong imposing this national security law, actually that move even enjoys a lot of support from the Chinese public, because they also feel like, what, we have given, the mainlanders have given so much support to Hong Kong's development. They often talk about back in '99, the Asia financial crisis, how Zhu Rongji, spent Chinese money to support Hong Kong dollar and all that. So, why it's one country, why shouldn't we move in that direction? So so what I'm just saying, it's just really trying to balance the view a little bit, in terms of the view outside China versus the view inside China, and the view among some liberal thinkers in China versus the view among the general public in China.
Well,
So, but obviously, this kind of support is not guaranteed for the party or Xi Jinping personally at all. Going forward, the test still is there. Economically speaking, this greater role by the state sector. Right now, yes, they're helping China's economy recover, as exemplified by the latest GDP numbers. State investment, rose while private investment continued to plunge. But longer term, if China, if the 老百姓, the general public, can get that kind of benefit in longer, just their own well-being, they don't feel like they can keep making progress with their lives and etc. That support would just erode just as quickly, and that's a bigger test. And also, in terms of the relationship with the U.S., as you well know, Charlene, in New York, every single Chinese leader has been judged by how well or how poorly they have handled the relationship with the U.S. Mao Zedong, despite all the mistakes he's made, Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, people credit him for forming the diplomatic ties with Nixon. And Deng Xiaoping, obviously, further advanced that relationship. Jiang Zemin, obviously, much better than anyone out there, was the WTO entry. Even under Hu Jintao, that's basically China coming of age, that kind of moment, So ultimately, Xi's performance also will be judged by within both the party and by the public, how he handles the U.S.-China relationship. He can't just blame Trump. I think the jury still is out, and maybe 5 years from now we will have another conversation about this question.
Right. Thank you very, very much. I don't know, you look like you wanted to say something. I don't want you not to say things. You're on mute.
No, I'm actually listening carefully. I was wondering what Bob has to say on this one, but as after all these names of, how to deal with the United States, Charlene, later maybe you can tell us about how the other person unnamed so far has dealt with the United States. That was former Prime Minister Junji, and how you actually saw him being a patriot, how to maintain a relationship with the largest economy in the world.
Well, I think in terms of Zhuangji, of course, he was a proponent, the key proponent of reform and opening during that period. Very astute, very brilliant guy who I think took a cold-eyed view of where China was and where it would need to be, and saw as the most critical road, WTO accession, because it would force China to continue to open up and reform its internal economy and reform its trading relations with other countries. Of course, that sort of sense of, convergence toward Western norms, not sameness, but convergence toward, movement toward, began to sputter around 2006, 2007, under Hu Jintao, and under Xi Jinping it stopped. And so you see a very different ethos, if you will, where during Hu Jintao, the word reform rarely appeared with the word opening, meaning reform was reform within China for Chinese companies, but not necessarily a benefit to foreign companies. And reform and opening now is used as a bit of a sop, if you will, I think, to foreign governments, but is very long in coming. Bob, I wanted to ask you, as you look at the way Xi Jinping has handled China, as Ling Ling talked about, he also has laid down a series of markers with respect to essentially free speech around the world. So, for example, as you and Ling Ling know, reporters have to be increasingly cautious in reporting on China. Academics, for now a number of years, recognize that if they write critically of China, their visas may not be renewed, and this has happened a number of times. Business leaders are very cautious in China and in discussing the Chinese, even when they're back in the US. They restrain what they would ordinarily say about almost any other government in the world. And of course, within China, you see a Chinese government that is more repressive. So Bob, I wanted to ask you how you handle this issue of self-censorship. How do newspapers in general continue to operate sort of under the journalistic standards and traditions that they've always followed when China exacts a price for honesty and directness?
Well, I think, well, a couple of things. One, I think you're certainly right about the self-censorship. I think that was on display during this trade battle where the US corporate interests were supportive, to the degree they were supportive of the Trump administration. It was supportive of the idea of taking it to China on issues like intellectual property protection and pressure to hand over technology. All that was fine, but companies rarely would talk publicly about their problems. They would talk through their trade associations, and the trade associations in their public filings anyway were fairly general sorts of complaints that they had. So any of the complaints that were made on specifics were made behind closed doors. Lingling and I did a big piece on the question of forced technology transfer, focused a lot on DuPont and on Huntsman, and you can be sure that they were not happy or helpful remotely when we found out some things about it. In fact, the only company I can think of that took a different position was Micron Technology. They seemed to take the idea, they were concerned about their big competitor Jinhua getting their technology. They helped the Taiwanese prosecute Jinhua, and then pushed the administration to put Jinhua on the entity list, with sort of a blackmail list, which basically killed the company. But that's a very, very unusual situation. I mean, in terms of how the newspapers deal with this, I mean, Lingling definitely can has a better perspective on this, given that she's one of the people forced out. I mean, it's a very difficult position. It's a very difficult position to be in. We never, the Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post, that whose reporters were also expelled, never hired on the basis of nationality, but they wound up expelling all the American reporters. Well, presumably now we will all hire, non-Americans. But the question there is, well, once you hire a non-American, will that be then the next round where, anyone working for a particular Western publication is barred? But as I say, Lingling has very personal experiences with this.
Lingling, do you want to address this, or would you rather take a pass?
Sure. I mean, the only thing I would add to what Bob just said is, now more than ever, there's this greater need to know what's going on in China because of the role China is playing and the kind of direction China is going. So this kind of expulsions of American journalists really not serving in China's interest, especially when they still talk about economic reform and opening up, especially in the capital markets. You won't, I personally, I have been approached by quite a few American businesses. So they told me in person that how they think their operations in China would suffer as a result of a potential decline in quality of information coming out of China. So I think that's really a real concern. But right now, the MO under President Xi Jinping is pretty clear, right? To protect whatever the US does,
Yeah.
China will hit back. Really, it's just this do something impulse is very, very strong. And, it's also very, very dangerous. So because there's so much to lose. So anyway, I would just add that.
Thank you.
Also, if I can just say one more thing. I mean, the administration basically picked this fight on freedom of press issues for an administration that is not exactly friendly to the press. But I just think it's just a losing fight. I mean, you're dealing with a regime that has no interest in the freedom of the press, no tradition of it. And, it's the old story about an eye for an eye, for the tooth for a tooth, and you wind up blind and toothless. I mean, it's just, we're winding up with fewer and fewer American reporters there, which, as Ling Ling says, is a big problem. And so, and also, frankly, on the US side as well. So there are fewer Chinese reporters in Washington and in New York. So what is the US afraid of? And it is also becoming a problem for Chinese nationals who work for American and European publications. It's a disastrous policy, I think.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most serious issues because it strikes at a fundamental difference between China and the US, with China taking, of course, from the US point of view, an extremely regressive view, and it's hard to square that circle, frankly. In that light, and I think based on something Ling Ling said with the impulse to just act and so on, I want to read you a quote from China's ambassador to the US, Ambassador Cui, which I found actually fairly shocking. And the quote is this: America must make a fundamental choice whether it can live with a modernized, strong, and prosperous China. The fundamental question is simple. Is the US ready or willing to live with another country with a very different culture, a very different political and economic system, in peace and cooperation on global challenges? When I saw this quote, I thought, so this is a take it or leave it quote. Is the US willing to accept a country with a very different system, different political system, different economic system, different culture, and work on common challenges, right? The default is always, well, we work on common challenges. The rest, to me, this signaled, was take it or leave it, meaning China will not change. I'm not suggesting China should change its political system, but it's a very harsh view when you always talk, as he did, about the economic system being fundamentally different. So I'm curious to know how you would interpret this quote from Ambassador Cui, who's a veteran diplomat, really outstanding diplomat, how you would read it, and what conclusions you think the US should draw from it. And if I could start with Bob and then go to Ling Ling.
Well, I mean, I think it's a very elegant formulation by a diplomat who's not one of the wolf warriors, not an aggressive, American baiter kind of person. But I mean, it is, I agree with you, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, it's not just that China is a different system. It's not that, China's, Sweden or something and has a socialist system and, my God, the US is the sort of exemplar of capitalism. Can it deal with, a Nordic country that's much more socialist? I mean, it is a question of values, in terms of, the oppression of minorities, the oppression of freedom in Hong Kong, which strike at, American sense of fairness and European and Western sense of fairness. it's also the question of, you know, military challenges and so on, right? I mean, it's not as if China isn't expanding into the South China Sea. It's not as if it's not posing challenges to the US in a variety of different ways. So, I mean, yeah, they can put it that way, but that's not the way I don't think any American administration would ever see it. And I think even if this president, who's obviously taken a very aggressive stand, were to lose, I don't see that a successor, I don't see that a Biden administration would take much more of a different stand on that kind of challenge.
I agree with you certainly on that, and on sort of the view that if the administration changed, there's unlikely to be any form of what I would loosely call capitulation. But Ling, tell me how you think about this quote and what it portends.
Sure, Charlene. I'm really glad you brought up this quote. Just like you, I was very surprised by the tone and the harshness of those remarks, because, you know, as we all know, Ambassador Cui Tiankai is considered, you know, the more, you know, a real diplomat, right? He always sees his job as building bridges, not burning bridges, like some of his colleagues at the foreign ministry has done recently. You know, before this quote, there are quite a couple of occasions he was only pretty much the only one, you know, representing the government actually trying to extending some olive branches to the U.S. side. Basically, like there are still ways we can talk and cooperate, but this really, it's quite a 180-degree turn from that kind of tone. I think it really sums up Xi Jinping thought on foreign policy, American policy, pretty well right now. So in the leader's view, the days of the U.S. bossing around China is over. So that's pretty, you know, the ball is in the U.S. court. You know, you have to, when the Chinese side, you know, throughout the trade war talked about mutual respect and, you know, all that equal basis of equality, that was not simple slogans or just, you know, propaganda with no meaning. They actually really meant it. That's what they wanted. They think they deserved respect and wanted the respect. So they think that, you know, China has arrived. China is the second largest economy. Many US companies and European companies can't really afford to lose access to this fastest growing market. So that remains the leadership's trump card. So, you know, they just don't think that all, you know, China, also Xi Jinping's popularity also partly in large part depends on standing up to foreign forces like the US in particular. So, you know, that just shows the fundamental shift in how the China deals with a big country like the US. You know, no longer, you know, you remember this so clearly back in 1990 when you were in the final stages of the trade talks, the China's WTO negotiations. In that year, amazing that the tragic accident happened, right? The U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and even under that kind of situation, President Jiang Zemin was able to stick to his top agenda, which was get China into WTO, really do the opening. After 2 months of, you know, propaganda, all that, you know, aimed against the U.S., everything was back to normal. And Jiang famously said, whatever happened, let's not deviate from our core interests. So now the agenda, is China dream, which in short means having a very strong, unified China, economically, technologically, politically, that adheres wholeheartedly to the one-party system. So, you know, the top policy agenda shifted, and the leaders of also, you know, a different person, different style. So that's why we're seeing this much more hawkish tone coming out of Beijing these days.
Do you have a comment you'd want to make about this?
No, I mean, it's, I think very clear also as Europeans, we notice that China has made up its mind, and the word compromise seems to be not in the dictionary anymore. We are struggling with the investment agreement. We thought that given that we are between the US and China, there will be more accommodation, but there seems to be very little political room to maneuver for Xi Jinping. And that basically leads me to the room to maneuver in order to get something signed like the phase one deal. I have a question for the three of you. First to Charlene, would you have put your signature under a deal like this? Would you have basically signed off on this kind of managed trade that the Europeans are lamenting about, the fact that the biggest free trader in the world all of a sudden signs up certain quantities with certain partners, which excludes others. But there are good parts in this phase one on IPR and forced technology transfer. So which parts do you think will survive and which parts would you have signed up to? And of course, the managed trade would be interesting. And then of course to Ling Wei, it's Wei Ling, it's you know, the talk of town in Beijing is that actually the phase one negotiations have caused the severity of COVID-19 because it has taken away the attention of the top leadership for the first 2 weeks, where the in-tray apparently was full with US trade talk. We have to get this doing, and the warnings that came from Wuhan and other places were not really heard. Now with this, why did China then focus so much on that? And really, was it pressured? Did they want to get it off the back? Why did China sign up to phase one? And for Bob, I was told that, as you mentioned Lighthizer a couple of times, I was told that Lighthizer has a picture in his living room, the signing of the Plaza Accord of 1995. And so the idea was, you know, to have something similar next to it, signing off a China deal, which then possibly was put in stop to China's rise as it did with Japan. Is that really true? I mean, the picture, of course, but then, of course, Bob Leiter, the American attention was in order to actually not just have a deal, but also to stop China's rise. So maybe whoever wants to go first.
I'll just say very briefly that, you know, the phase one deal was a US and China deciding they needed to have a deal. And that's what the phase one deal is. I mean, it's a shadow of what the administration was after and doesn't impact most of the major structural changes that the US indicated it wanted to see. But Trump, for his own reasons, and ultimately Xi Jinping for his own reasons, and we can all speculate on what they might be, and Bob and Ling, I think, can elucidate that for us, decided he needed a deal. So it was enough. Whatever it was enough. The agriculture numbers, I think, were always fantastical to begin with. And I think it's unfortunate that in demanding these kinds of numbers, you're simply strengthening the hold of state enterprises on the economy in this area and in other areas, because remember, this purchase commitment goes beyond simply agriculture to also touch on manufactured goods. I can't imagine it's in the US interest to see state enterprises further looped into the day-to-day economic fortunes of China and to become even larger competitors of the US ultimately. So I think that it's an unfortunate series of provisions in an agreement which Trump ultimately decided he would settle for now, and hence naming it phase one. I don't think anyone expects to see a phase two.
Okay. I'll take the Chinese side, the question for the Chinese side. It's really interesting to hear from you, York, the talk of town in China these days about how, you know, the phase one, negotiating for phase one might have distracted leadership from the bigger, you know, the bigger issue that was brewing, starting to emerge at the time, which was the viral outbreak in Wuhan. I think there's another bigger issue in Xi Jinping's mind that actually made Beijing to commit to what appeared both then and now a very unrealistic trade agreement, which was Hong Kong. As we know now that President Xi Jinping started to draft the Hong Kong national security law as far back as last summer, when it was becoming really clear that the leaders in Hong Kong themselves, wouldn't have the capacity and capabilities to pass through the legislation. So Xi basically took it into his own hands. So how would those two things related? Obviously, the party leadership has always been very savvy. They know what their top priorities are, and most of the time, sovereignty issues definitely on top of their list. And obviously, they anticipated a potential backlash from the Western world, including the U.S. Anything they do to Hong Kong, which turned out to be a massive crackdown on the existing autonomy. So having this trade deal really can be used as additional leverage on the Trump administration, which doesn't really care about human rights anyway. But given the increasing hawkish views in Washington against China, I mean, that can serve as basically, additional leverage for Beijing to use. We have phase one trade deal. If you meddle too much, cross our red lines, including issues involving Hong Kong, the deal may not hold. And the timing is, perfect for Beijing, because right now it's up, 4 months away from the U.S. election, and tearing apart this trade agreement certainly wouldn't help Trump win the re-election. So I think, in hindsight, I wish I could have explained better how this sovereignty and geopolitical issues played into Beijing's calculation in terms of having a trade agreement with the U.S.
So on the Lighthizer question of the portrait, that's a great anecdote. I don't know if it's true. I mean, the only portrait that I know of, which is quite revealing about Lighthizer, is that when he turned 40, he had a big portrait of himself painted, and he put it in his living room. And he said, everybody should get one of those. And when somebody said, do you mean like a portrait? No, he says, no, a portrait of me, and it's sort of the cocky guy who, is full of himself, sounds a lot like Trump. And you could imagine why, even though they didn't know each other, why they would get along. It's also possible, I mean, Lighthizer came up and got noticed as a negotiator, as a trade negotiator over Japan at USTR. It was steel, not over currency, but still he looked at Japan as the kind of predator that he considers China to be. So might he have thought that a Plaza deal was, a clever move by the Americans to cripple Japan? Yeah, in retrospect, that would seem like he might. I don't think that's hugely overreading what the Plaza Accord was like at that time. Japan went into a funk for a lot of reasons. Currency was one of them, but there were many, many other reasons. And so in terms of Lighthizer thinking about China, I mean, China was, after Japan kind of faded away, China was his obsession. I mean, he got rich suing foreign companies on the behest of steel companies over dumping cases. Chinese companies were, some of the biggest, he won some of the biggest cases in terms of dumping. And he had mapped out a whole strategy about how to take on China, which he really never thought he'd get a chance to try to put into action. I mean, here he was, a guy who was known as a protectionist in a town like Washington, where neither the Republicans nor the Democrats, or at least the Democrats who wind up in the White House, really wanted a protectionist. And then Donald Trump came around, and he was the perfect USTR for somebody like Trump, because he knows trade policy very well. He's very smart, and he's very careful as a lawyer, unlike, say, the lawyers who represented the administration on immigration matters, who got reversed in the court time after time after time. I mean, Lighthizer was careful. Now, on the other hand, as the confrontation continued and continued, and I agree with Charlene that basically at the end, they just decided enough was enough. They needed a deal. He is ultimately, even though he was certainly ideologically opposed to China, he had a client as a lawyer. His client was the president. The client needed a deal, and he got the best deal he felt that he could. And in the end, we were talking before about Zhu Rongji. I think Lighthizer, to a very surprising degree, wound up like many, many U.S. negotiators and economic officials looking for the next Zhu Rongji, looking for the next reformer that would understand that really what the U.S. wanted was in China's interest. And it only took, finding the right people who would understand that. And instead of Zhu Rongji, he had Liu He, who genuinely is an economic reformer, but doesn't have nearly the political power that Zhu Rongji had, or the political skills that Zhu Rongji had. And Zhu also had the backing of a president. He had Jiang Zemin behind him, and Liu He, didn't have that to the same degree. So in a funny way, I think Lighthizer wound up closer to his predecessors than he would think, even that he would admit.
This is the European Chamber, and two superpowers are dancing. We wonder what's going to happen to us in between, and how we should deal with this. Of course, we are an economic superpower, but the security issues and the currency issues are definitely hurting us a lot. One example, and I would like to have all of you basically reflecting on this one, is Huawei. The US tells us in Europe not to buy Huawei, to the point where now the UK has pulled out. Even Hungary, the country that's closest to China, now decided not to buy Huawei, something which is hardly known. And China is threatening Europeans, if you don't buy Huawei, we're going to really, really crack down on you, despite the fact that actually our continent has two companies very able to install 5G gear. So what's going to happen to this? I mean, it seems to be like between a rock and a hard place. And the European Commission is now contemplating how to deal with this one, in particular, as both parties might impose very, very tough punishments on our governments as well as our companies. What's your view on this kind of being in between?
So let me say something about the restrictions on Huawei. It's very interesting. What you say obviously is right. The UK backed off. I didn't know about Hungary. Germany's thinking about it also. But the restrictions that were put on foreign companies have loophole after loophole in them. So it's very interesting how with the UK, they've cited these rules that they believe would prevent foreign suppliers from supplying Huawei and would cripple Huawei eventually. But there are ways around it. There are lots of ways around it. It's just very interesting to me that the companies are going by clearly the political direction of this administration, but not using the legal, or at least so far anyway, not using the clear legal workarounds that there are with these new rules. The first round of rules, which was supposed to have stopped American companies from supplying China, had plenty of loopholes also, and American companies took advantage of them. But this time, for reasons I'm not really all that clear on, it looks as if the political will of the US is cowing the companies, cowing the suppliers.
Ling Ling, do you have a view on that?
Sure. I agree that many companies, including those in Europe, are getting caught between hard and rock place. At the same time, I also do think the Chinese government is in a dilemma as well. Obviously, there are lots of threats. getting dished out these days by Chinese officials. Oh, if you do this to Huawei, we could do this and that to your companies. Like the journal ran a story today about Ericsson, Nokia potentially become a victim in this whole geopolitical firefight. However, obviously China cannot really retaliate without hurting itself, shooting itself in the foot, especially at a time when a lot of multinationals are rethinking about their supply chains. As you know very well on the ground there, York, I'm sure people from the Commerce Ministry, when they reach out to you guys, they're very interested in knowing whether or not you're shifting your supply chains out of China. How are you planning your investments going forward? After all, multinational companies, including those from America and the EU, employing millions of workers in China, and still instrumental to the country's rise up the industrial value chains. So all those, they have to be very, very, very careful with the retaliation stuff. As Bob just mentioned, there's so many loopholes in existing US regulations against Huawei anyway. And China so far, hasn't really disclosed any American companies on its so-called unreliable list either. The concerns over supply chains moving out certainly is a reason. And also, they wanted to also see exactly how effective U.S. regulations against Huawei are, and the potential EU sanctions or UK sanctions against Huawei are. So they're going to also move very, very cautiously, in a kind of dilemma as well.
So let me ask a question. Huawei really brings up a good example of this. Why has China embarked on wolf warrior diplomacy? Why is it going after Australia, going after Canada, going after various or threatening European countries, acting in a very coercive manner around the world at the same time? As it also, as Bob was saying earlier, continues to be increasingly aggressive in the seas. Why? Why is this happening? And what does China hope to gain in this very aggressive, coercive behavior when it comes to countries around the world?
Sure. This whole wolf warrior diplomacy really is not new for the Communist Party leadership. Chairman Mao took good advantage of that, used that frequently during his reign of China. Many people compare Xi's leadership today to Mao's many years ago. There are definitely some resemblance, but for Xi, for the party, it's always like that. Take out the foreign forces and slap them around a little bit especially when there's a domestic crisis. This time around, it was really the pandemic. Back in January, March, even through the early part of February, and even through the early part of March, the party was also under siege domestically because the very drastic measures, and because the surge was totally unexpected, and a lot of people complaining. You look at China's social media at the time; it was a lot of resentment and frustration from the Chinese public. So for the party leadership, first and foremost, their number one priority always is rallying support around the party, make sure the party stays in power. So the deflecting attention from the domestic problems certainly was part of the reason for the resurgence of the wolf warrior diplomacy this time around. And also, it's also in line with how Xi Jinping views China these days and his vision for China. China has already risen, not being, the days of China getting pushed around, it's over. And, China has a lot to teach the rest of the world, things like how to control pandemic. So that's the kind of thing you hear over and over again from the Chinese officials. At the same time, they're constantly, when you talk to Chinese officials, they're constantly mystified why China has no friends. Like, we're doing so great, right? They're like we're doing so great. We survived the trade war. We're doing great with the pandemic. And look at the US, look at Europe. But and we're supplying the whole world with those PPE, those items. But why you guys still pointing fingers at us? The only explanation in their view, it's the US. The US is the bad guy here. The US is asking, all his friends to gang up on China.
Yeah, maybe I can, Charlie, maybe I can ask our chief censor, Rachel, who's, by the way, stuck at the East Coast in the US since January, to chip in questions from our members.
Please.
Thanks, York. Going back to what Ling Ling accurately described as a geopolitical firefight between companies on either side of this trade war and tech war, someone from the audience asked an interesting question referring to this speech that Attorney General Barr made last week, in which he criticized corporate leaders in the US for essentially capitulating to the Chinese government, alluding that they may be pawns of the government and might have to register as foreign lobbyists under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So quite a statement and a criticism to make. And the question is, and if I may also chip in my own question, how are corporations supposed to respond to this? We saw before that the trade lobby was incredibly strong to push forth on negotiations with China, despite human rights abuses and other various criticisms from the government and civil society. So where does business in the US go from this?
Bob, you want to take?
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, Charlene, you should really comment on this also, to say at least. I mean, I think, well, first of all, sort of into the veracity of the comments. I mean, over the years, U.S. corporations have been China's best lobbyists. There's kind of no, ifs, ands, or buts about it. I mean, the people who've been involved on China lobbying, for years and years would acknowledge that, right? I mean, that has been changing to some degree because of dissatisfaction, with China. Although, as we've been saying, most of the criticism is sub rosa because companies are afraid of getting their head chopped off. So there's that. So there is something, to the criticism that corporate interests do kind of carry water for the Chinese government. On the other hand, I think there was a clear effort to intimidate corporate executives, in terms of what they would say publicly, about China and what it would say publicly about the administration taking on China. I mean, it is an administration that operates often through intimidation. And I think, this was another example. I don't think anyone's really going to get sued under FARA, but who knows? I mean, you have to now take that into consideration.
Can I just sort of raise a question that I would hate for us to leave tonight with this unanswered? Given everything that the two of you have written and given what we've talked about tonight, maybe capped by the quote from Ambassador Cui, is the US-China relationship irrecoverable? So by that I mean the following. Is it possible that you will see a Western world in one camp and a China-led some other camp on the other side. In other words, I would ask the question, who is decoupling from whom? And this is not so clear to me. Or to put it another way, I think a strong case could be made that China is also, and has been actually for some time, decoupling. The internet being the first thing, obviously. But I'd be interested in your view about whether we're in an irrecoverable situation and the US should simply build out its own Western bloc, if you will. And I don't know how Europe would respond to that, Jörg.
So, I mean, one of the themes of our book is that we're at the edge, the precipice of a new Cold War. Maybe we're in a Cold War. You know, it's hard to date something like that. The first Cold War usually is dated to Winston Churchill's speech, I think it was in Missouri, talking about an Iron Curtain. I would think, you know, the odds are greater that no matter who wins the next election, that the two countries continue to disengage, continue to challenge one another. The US certainly has a whole web of alliances, right, dating back to World War II, if not before that. I'm not clear what China's, you know, equivalent of the Warsaw Bloc would be, right? I mean, I guess the Belt and Road Initiative was some effort, you know, to do that. Russia, maybe. But I think, I mean, is it irredeemable, irrevocable? You know, never say never, right? I mean, if we were in 1955 or whatever, you would look at Maoist China and think, my God, will they ever, you know, work closely with the United States? You'd say no. So I think if there is a will, for the sake of argument, with a new administration in particular, if there's a will, there are ways in which you could soften the confrontation. So, you know, Biden has talked about wanting to get back into the Paris Accord. He's talked about wanting to revive the Iran deal. You know, to do that, you need China. There's no way around it. So if there's a will, there is some possibility of, you know, taking the edge off, I would say. And also, you know, the pandemic obviously shows the need, you know, to work cooperatively with every country, you know, over health issues that don't recognize any border. So I wouldn't say irrevocable, but I would say the odds are much greater that we're moving in that direction.
Right, I agree with what Bob just described, and you know, I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic. I do think we're already in a new Cold War right now, and one milestone event could be the national security law in Hong Kong, and you are already seeing that, you know, basically different countries reacted differently to this Chinese move. The Western democracies largely, you know, voiced a strong opposition to the Chinese move, led by the US, the UK, and other EU countries. On the other hand, the countries in Africa, you know, the main targets for Xi Jinping's Belt and Road program voted for the Chinese move. So I think the very two distinct blocs are already emerging. So whether or not it's recoverable or not, Bob just laid out a potential opening for, you know, for at least, you know, the new beginning, which is you know, a potential change of the person in charge of the White House. You know, if you talk to some Chinese officials, they would tell you the same thing. They actually prefer this multilateral approach. You know, China is so good at really talking and having dialogues. That's the way they prefer. However, I guess, you know, the biggest thing, this trade war, has done to the party leadership is that, you know, the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner, and unlike in the late in the late 60s and the early 70s, when Mao Zedong had a very strong incentive to cozy up to the U.S., which was Soviet Union, the threat from Soviet Union, that was no longer the case. Russia, if you know, by any kind of measurement, they had quite a incentives to cozy up to China these days. And the WTO entry, you know, that kind of incentive also is gone. So foreign pressure is no longer good for reforms in China anymore. So to have any kind of change within China, it has to come within the country. The pressure has to come from within. Yeah. Absent of that, you really hard to see these two countries coming closer together.
Charlene, I don't see any exit ramp actually at this stage. The elections are going to go along with the China bashing theme, and that's possibly going to set the stage for the next administration. If it's Biden, he will handle this possibly much smarter, in particular as he will reach out to allies across the world and trying to so find common ground with the like-minded democracies, OECD plus India, for example. And that will be a different political setting for China. And Angela Merkel, who is now having the presidency of the European Council, she will be very cautious. She doesn't certainly want to put oil in the anti-China fire that Trump has unleashed. But at the same time, she's very much aware about the kind of challenges that China poses on the European Union and the society when it comes to free speech, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and. Ursula von der Leyen made it very clear that the new commission will be more geopolitical. This should send up a wake-up call to Beijing, in particular, as European Commission decided to label China as a competitor, as a partner, as well as a systemic rival. This is not going to go away. So we still have a window as Europe. I think that it's going to be more difficult. The companies are definitely more worried about this politically charged environment, the kind of punishment they come across if their government does something badly. And we can see it now with the UK. Then Hong Kong, of course, is a big worry. Hong Kong is extremely important to us as a financial center and as an information hub, despite the small role it plays in the Chinese economy. There definitely we have to see. The word that I come across in Beijing these days is that we are in 1962. Of course, the COVID crisis where China comes out of it successfully is very different from the Great Leap Forward, but we do have a leadership that certainly had taken a hit there. Second, the world is distracted. COVID in today's world, the Cuba Crisis in 1962. Now, we don't have to end up in 1966, of course, but we should be very wary about the fact that many of us in the leaderships across the world are sleepwalking, assuming that we're going to get back to this. It needs an effort, and the effort also has to come from China, I guess. With this little preaching, I go to Rachel with the next question, please.
Thanks, Jörg. So we did touch upon some of this already, but this is a question from our Chamber Vice President, Jens Eskelund in Beijing. What would need to happen for a de-escalation in US-China relations? And how realistic is it that we could see any meaningful improvements in the next 3 to 5 years? More broadly, what is your best guess as to what our relations look like, US-China relations 5 years from now?
Well, I think we did cover some of that. You know, let's take it if Trump wins re-election. So if Trump wins re-election, I don't see that there's any movement on the economic front or the trade and economic front. I agree with Charlene. I think Lingling and I both agree with Charlene that there's no real prospects for a phase 2, given that phase 2 trade deal, given that there's no real incentive for China to make the kind of concessions that would be required. I think in a weird way, you might see a second Trump administration be more multilateral than the first term on China, in the sense that when it comes to human rights and security issues, it's widespread agreement among the Western allies. And, they might work more closely with the traditional Western allies on those kind of issues. I mean, if Biden were to win, as I said, I think there are some possibilities. I mean, the tone would change, certainly. There are some possibilities if he wants to take them, which again, it's unclear whether he would. He also talked in the primary about rejoining or renegotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, however it's renamed. Could try to do that. I mean, I doubt you'll see very much in the campaign about concrete proposals, given that he has a big lead, and I don't think that he will try to put out proposals that could garner him a lot of criticism. But also remember, he would inherit a world where 3/4 of everything China sells to the US is under tariffs, and he would not, no American president would just give that up for nothing. And so I think the prospects are pretty pessimistic. There are some possibilities again, but generally not so much. I mean, the other part that we're not talking about, this is all about Washington, is what does Beijing do? What does Beijing do to try to unstick things? Ambassador Cui's commentary to the contrary, I mean, the ball is in much Beijing's court as it is in the US. So, I mean, will they back off on certain, escalatory actions in the South China Sea? Will they make, overtures on economic issues? I mean, there's a lot of things Beijing could do to try to unfreeze things as well.
I think we have space for 2 more questions from Rachel.
Thanks. So the next one is from Shu Sital, Chief China Economist at Deloitte. Are US sanctions going to have any meaningful effect if the EU and Japan take different routes?
No, no, they won't. I mean, I think the question again is, will companies bend to the political will of the United States, not necessarily what the legal rights that you might have under the particular Commerce Department regulations. And the US assertion is extraterritorial, right? The US assertion of power is to block foreign companies, not just American companies, but foreign companies from supplying Huawei. If foreign companies go along with it, yeah, they'll have significant impact. If they don't, probably not.
Rachel?
Last question.
Yes, last question, quite an interesting question. This is from Julian, the Vice Chair of the British Chamber. Do the Chinese want Trump reelected? And if I may add on to that, can we distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese leadership? Do they have different views on the matter?
So I would love to, if I could make a comment. So my own view is absolutely they want Trump, because every day Trump is in office, he weakens the United States. So China, nor Russia, could ever have disintermediated our allies as effectively and as quickly as Trump has done. And of course, one of the foreign policy concerns China has long had is the US alliance structure, because our alliance structure is based on a number of things, including mutual defense. So, which is one reason China doesn't want alliances. But I think that to the extent our alliance structure is weakened, to the extent that makes it easier for China to disintermediate, as it's doing in Europe, between the southern European states and the rest of Europe, to the extent the US isolates itself, this is very much in China's interest because it weakens the United States. It also hurts us economically. So my own view for a long time is that yes, they would like Trump reelected. And Ling Ling can certainly comment much more knowledgeably than me, but my impression is that the Chinese people rather like Trump, in the sense that there's something very familiar about him to them, including familiar about the family-owned company and doing whatever it takes to ensure that company succeeds. So I'm not sure the Chinese people in this sense would have a view different from their government.
Right. I agree with what Charlene just said. I would only add one thing to quote a Chinese official when he referred to Trump. He said something like, Trump is a gift for China.
Yeah.
May I end this with a question to the three of you? Recently, the very smart Fang Xinhai, who is the vice chair of the Securities Commission, said something very interesting. He worries, or he showed that the Chinese leadership that is knowledgeable about this topic is worried about the US using the dollar as a weapon. He even put this in the context of how the US has been treating Russia. Do the three of you see that actually after a trade war, in the midst of a tech war, we might actually end up also in a financial war?
So again, let's sort of take it if Trump's reelected or Biden. I mean, I think even if, put it this way, I think even if Trump's reelected, I doubt it. I mean, for the US to treat China, say like Iran, you know, to cut them off from the dollar would be quite a blow, to say the least, but it would also be a blow to the primacy of the dollar. And I don't think that's where the US wants to be. When it gets to non-trade issues, when it gets to, you know, sort of broader economic issues, when it gets to security issues, when it gets to human rights issues, Trump employs a lot of people who think China is the biggest threat to the United States since the rise of fascism. But that is not who he is. In a weird way, or not in a weird way, but in a very fundamental way, on these kinds of issues, Trump is a moderate within his own administration. So, I mean, if you have the Treasury Secretary and the NEC Director, as they certainly would, arguing that you're going to, you know, undermine the role of the dollar in global commerce, I think he would, I think the chances are very, very, very slim that he would actually pull the trigger. And I think the same thing goes, I don't think, you know, Biden administration would even consider it.
The ladies? And you, no?
Right, I would just only add one thing. You know, Fang Xinhai, obviously, he has been one of the more reform-minded officials in China. I guess, you know, one of the reasons he wanted, you know, brought up this potential threat from the US about, you know, the dollar delinquent is that, you know, potentially another opportunity for China to push forward with capital market liberalization. I mean, for quite a number of years now, the whole renminbi internationalization effort has stalled after the disastrous reform effort and devaluation in 2015, right? You know, IPO reforms and all that, you know, it's moving along, but still it doesn't really, the leadership, you know, all those priorities on their desk is probably the last document they're going to read after reading South China Sea, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and all those others, right? So this by talking up a threats like this, you know, could give those people, the you know, so-called reformers, some kind of help them provide some kind of impetus for the leadership to move on those areas. Now you see, you know, I just talked to someone in Shanghai recently, one of the senior security exchange officials, you know, he was really anxious about the US delisting Chinese companies in the US markets. You know, initially they all thought about Hong Kong as this backup plan for Chinese companies to move to. And now the US threatening Hong Kong as well. And so now they think, oh, okay, maybe we have to rely on our own markets, the Asian markets in Shanghai and Shenzhen. So that's why in the past couple of weeks, you're really hearing, you know, more talks, more urgency in terms of the IPO reforms, etc.
Yeah, I would just say that at China Development Forum, I don't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, but a Chinese official was saying that they arrayed as a column all of the things that the US has and does around the world. And in that array, only one item was circled as what China would want. It was and China's absolutely right. So that is of extraordinary benefit to the United States, and from China's point of view, extraordinary disadvantage. I think it's one reason you now see these experiments on digital currency, on trying to further internationalize the use of the yuan in various trade and other transactions, but not in this very casual way, but really pushing this. It's a function as well of Belt and Road, because a lot of the contracts are written in Chinese currency, not in dollar-denominated currency. So I think you see China realizing that one of the things that makes the US strong and gives the US extraordinary market power, if you will, around the world is the dollar. So anything that the US would do to weaponize the dollar, or as Bob was saying, to try and cut China from the dollar, simply encourages China to really ramp up the self-sufficiency as much as they could to try and compensate for that disadvantage. That's not in the US interest. It certainly is not in the interest of the dollar being maintained as the world's key reserve currency. Look, in that respect, Trump action on this would be very similar to his action on technology. What the US technology policy has done is to underscore for China the importance of being entirely self-sufficient. Yeah. Now, why is that in the United States interest? It clearly is not in the US interest. I'm not saying China wouldn't have in any event wanted to become more self-sufficient, but now this is an absolute imperative of the leadership, and for good reason. One can understand exactly why they feel this way. So taking a similar approach with the dollar would have actually even more disastrous consequence for the US.
Yeah, we have to close the session now as we are closing shop. Let me just say that the European Chamber is working on a decoupling study that actually will look into these questions. And we will draw on this wonderful book from Ling and Bob. The survey will go out to you members in September, and we hope to have written it up when Biden gets inaugurated again. I would like to really thank Charlene for this contribution, moderation, and input as usual, very stimulating. And then of course Ling and Bob taking the time tonight in order to speak to our members. Again, the book is available. Check it out on Amazon. You can get it even into the Republic. Let me just say that we have another book lined up. It is my friend Dexter Tiff Roberts' book that came out already early this year, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. It's very interesting. The subtitle says, The Work of the Factory and the Future of the World. So tune in on the 24th, 9 a.m. Beijing time and 9 p.m. East Coast. And I would like to also thank Rachel. She's our chief censor on the East Coast. So to the three ladies and to Bob, good night, and to the members, a wonderful day doing business in China. And see you next time when Tiff and Evan are broadcasting this book. Thank you.